Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History War. Before German tanks stormed across the Soviet border in 1941, the country had already lost millions of lives to revolution, civil war, famine, and purges. When Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet soldier didn't step into hell. He had been living in it for 2 decades. That's why a society that seemed on the brink of collapse didn't fall apart. Instead, it pushed forward, all the way to Berlin. In this video, we'll trace history backward to understand how the Soviet Union survived and what the real cost of that victory was. If you're interested in war stories told plainly, without sugarcoating, make sure to subscribe to History War and join us as we dive into some of the harshest chapters in human history. In 1941, when the first German tanks crushed the western border of the Soviet Union, almost the entire world believed the story was over. Not a battle, not a drawn-out struggle, but a collapse foretold. To Western observers, the USSR was a young, raw nation ruled by terror, one that had just decapitated its own military leadership in a frenzy of purges. To Hitler, it was a hollow structure that would crumble with a strong enough push, and to many others, it was a historical experiment that had gone too far and was now reaching its inevitable end. But here's the paradox. The Soviet Union didn't collapse. Not only did it survive the summer and fall of 1941, but just 4 years later, the Red Army marched into Berlin, raising the red flag over the ruins of the Third Reich. To understand how that happened, you can't just start from June 22, 1941, because the Soviet Union's extraordinary endurance during the Great Patriotic War wasn't forged on the battlefield. It was shaped long before during peace, revolution, civil war, famine, and through years when the Soviet state had crushed its own society with a level of violence rarely seen in human history. The USSR didn't survive because it was strong in the conventional sense. It survived because its people were already used to living in hell. When the war came, the Soviet soldier didn't face a brand new horror. It was simply a continuation of the trauma they had already endured over the past 20 years. Hunger, fear, loss, mass death. These weren't shocking disruptions of normal life. They had become a brutal routine. In a country where millions had died from policy decisions in peacetime, death in wartime, though terrible, no longer shattered the psychological order like it would in other societies. And here, the historical paradox comes into focus. The very elements that made the USSR look fragile to the outside world, repression, brutality, the relentless sacrifice of human life, became the foundation of its resilience in the face of one of the most devastating invasions in human history. The Soviet state had learned how to operate in permanent crisis. It was used to issuing commands amid chaos, mobilizing through despair, and holding onto power even as society teetered on the edge of collapse. When Barbarossa hit, that system didn't break from shock. It simply shifted into a harsher version of itself. That doesn't mean the USSR was well prepared for war. On the contrary, the blow in 1941 nearly paralyzed its entire command structure, shattered armies, and left millions of soldiers encircled or forced to surrender. But unlike many other nations throughout history, that initial collapse didn't lead to the total disintegration of national will, because by then, that will had long since detached from ideals of victory or glory. It was tied to something far more primal, survival at any cost. In the West, war is often seen as a disruption of society's normal order. But for the Soviet Union, the normal order before 1941 was already a chain of unending crises. Revolution, civil war, forced collectivization, mass famine, the Great Purge. All of it had eroded any sense of safety, stability, or humanity in everyday life. When war broke out, the state didn't need to convince people that this was an unprecedented hardship. They had already lived through such times for an entire generation. This doesn't make Soviet endurance noble. It doesn't turn it into a pure story of heroism. On the contrary, it raises a cold and uncomfortable question. How broken must a society be in peacetime to be able to withstand the destruction of war? Was this bottomless endurance a strength, or simply the consequence of people being pushed to the point where they had nothing left to lose? When we look back at the summer of 1941, we often get lost in the sheer scale of it. Thousands of tanks destroyed, millions of prisoners taken, vast territories lost in just a few months. But behind those numbers was a society already familiar with large-scale loss. A society where death was no longer a personal tragedy. It was part of the statistics. And in that state of forced numbness, the Soviet Union found the will to keep fighting, even when every normal military logic said they had already lost. To understand how a country could lose millions of soldiers in the first year of war and still not collapse, we have to look back, not to general staff meetings or battle plans, but to the years when Russian society was torn apart from within. Before the German tanks arrived, the Soviet Union had already faced itself and had survived in the most brutal way. That's why the story of the Soviet Union's survival in 1941 doesn't begin in the wheat fields of Ukraine or the forests of Belarus. It begins in 1917, in the moment an empire collapsed and a new order was built through violence, fear, and mass sacrifice. Only by facing the reality of a country that was crushed before Hitler ever arrived can we begin to understand why, when faced with what should have been an unstoppable catastrophe, the Soviet Union stood firm, not as a healthy society, but as a machine forged in pain. Russia entered the 20th century not as a rising nation, but as an empire already rotting from within. When World War I broke out, the Russian Empire carried with it centuries of unresolved contradictions. A backward peasant society dragged into modern industrial warfare, a decaying aristocracy clinging to power, a bloated bureaucracy built more on personal loyalty than competence, and millions of people living in poverty, illiteracy, and voicelessness. The war didn't create these problems, it exposed them and pushed them to the breaking point. 1917 didn't arrive like a bolt from the blue. It came as the collapse of a structure that had long been hollowed out. When the Tsar abdicated, the old order didn't just lose its head, it lost its reason to exist. The institutions that had once maintained the empire's fragile stability disintegrated so quickly that no one could replace them with anything strong enough. In that vacuum, power wasn't transferred peacefully, it was seized by violence. Revolution did not bring about the gentle rebirth of a new society. It unleashed a chain reaction of collapse. The weak provisional government couldn't control the army, couldn't control food supplies, and certainly couldn't control the swelling expectations of the masses. Promises of peace, land, and bread became the most dangerous political currency. The more that was promised, the more impatient society grew when those promises didn't materialize. When the Bolsheviks took power, they didn't inherit a functioning state to reform. They stepped into a disintegrating entity, and the only way to hold on to power was to wield violence on an unprecedented scale. The Civil War wasn't just a clash between the Red Army and the White forces. It was the shattering of the entire social fabric. Every region, every village, every railway line became a battlefield. Power changed hands constantly. Loyalty was enforced at gunpoint, not earned through belief. In this chaos, death was no longer an exception. It became the default condition. Famine spread not as a sudden natural disaster, but as the inevitable result of war, forced requisitions, and the collapse of distribution systems. Millions died without leaving a personal mark on collective memory. They were absorbed into numbers, into dry reports, into a shared understanding that human life could be expended without explanation. During this period, a profound psychological transformation took place in Russian society. People learned to survive by shrinking their expectations. With no faith in legal protection, no belief in the stability of tomorrow, they clung to the smallest bonds: family, village, the military unit they were forced to join. Morality didn't vanish, it contracted, became flexible, ready to compromise with violence in order to endure. When the Civil War ended, the country didn't emerge from hell into peace. It shifted from one form of violence to another, more organized, more calculated. The fledgling Soviet state wasn't built on reconciliation, but on victory and suspicion. Those who survived the Civil War carried with them the memory that power existed only when backed by force. And those in power understood one thing clearly: this society had been broken. And precisely because of that, it could be reshaped. The following years were not a time of healing. They were a time of consolidating power by maintaining a constant state of tension. Peasants who had barely survived famine and forced requisitioning, workers who had just escaped war only to be swept into new mobilization campaigns, intellectuals who lived under the shadow of suspicion and self-censorship. Every class learned to stay silent. Not because they agreed, but because they understood the cost of speaking out. What's important to recognize is that Soviet society before 1941 wasn't a unified bloc forged by shared ideals. It was a tired, deeply wounded society, one that had adapted to its wounds. That adaptation wasn't noble or admirable. It was survival. When people grow used to constant loss, they develop a form of endurance that may appear strong from the outside, but in truth is simply numbness. Children born after the revolution grew up in a world where violence was the familiar language of power. They had no memory of the old order to compare it to. For them, it was normal for the state to command, to coerce, to punish. That generation came of age in the 1930s with a warped but enduring belief. The individual had no inherent value, only value granted or used by the state. From this foundation, a new kind of person slowly emerged. Not a hero in the romantic sense, but someone capable of withstanding extreme pressure, accepting loss as a fact of life, and continuing to exist under conditions that would have shattered other societies. When war came later, that generation didn't need to be taught how to endure suffering. They had lived in it since birth. But such a crushed society didn't operate on its own. It required a center of power ruthless and resolute enough to turn chaos into order. In the years after the Civil War, a machinery of control rose, one that understood all too well the psychology of fear, dependence, and exhaustion. It didn't aim to heal wounds, but to exploit them for governance. And it was here, when the country had been worn down to the point of collective helplessness, when society had become accustomed to top-down control, that a figure and a new method of rule stepped into the center of history. Not to heal, but to organize the pain. Not to eliminate crisis, but to make crisis the new normal. From the wreckage of revolution, civil war, and famine, a system of power took shape, one that turned suffering into a tool, fear into discipline, and survival into duty. And the name forever tied to that turning point was Stalin. When Stalin fully consolidated power in the late 1920s, he did not face a healthy society in need of leadership. He faced a body already deeply wounded, exhausted, and easy to manipulate. The scars from revolution and civil war hadn't healed before being layered over with a new form of violence, colder, more systematic. Stalin didn't create suffering from scratch. He inherited it, understood it, and, most importantly, learned how to use it as a tool of governance. In Stalin's logic, stability didn't come through reconciliation, but through total control. A society already accustomed to deprivation and fear could be mobilized swiftly, if directed properly. Agricultural collectivization, therefore, wasn't just an economic policy. It was a massive social restructuring effort, in which the state broke the traditional bonds between people and land, between villages and their autonomy. Millions of peasants were forced to abandon their old way of life and herded into collective farms they neither controlled, understood, nor trusted. The price of this process was famine, particularly in Ukraine and other key agricultural regions. But to Stalin, this wasn't a failure to be corrected, it was an acceptable loss. The Soviet state learned that society could endure levels of suffering far beyond what outside observers thought possible. When millions starved and the system still held, a chilling message was reinforced. Central authority could impose its will without needing the people's consent. Alongside rural restructuring came forced industrialization. Factories rose, cities swelled, and millions were swept into the machinery of production under brutal conditions. Long hours, harsh discipline, frequent accidents. But within that environment, a new kind of person emerged. One accustomed to commands, quotas, and being measured by output, not dignity. This became the psychological foundation that war would later exploit to its fullest. The height of turning suffering into a governance mechanism was the Great Purge. Here, Stalin did more than eliminate political rivals. He redefined the relationship between state and society entirely around fear. No one was safe. No one could be sure if they'd still be free tomorrow. Uncertainty became a more powerful tool of control than direct violence. When people didn't know where the limits of power lay, they set even stricter limits for themselves. The military was not exempt from this logic. Waves of senior officers were arrested, executed, or disappeared into labor camps. The military leadership was decapitated just as the world was rushing toward another major war. From a purely military perspective, it was a disaster. But from Stalin's political viewpoint, it was a reaffirmation. No institution could be allowed to exist outside the central authority's absolute control. A blindly loyal army, even if less competent, was safer than one that could think independently. The deeper consequence of these years wasn't just the number of dead or imprisoned, it was the reshaping of collective psychology. People learned to live in two parallel worlds, a public world of slogans, plans, and performative loyalty, and a private world of silence, suspicion, and self-preservation. This split corroded social trust, but also created a society that could function without it, because it didn't rely on trust, but on fear and ingrained obedience. Stalin didn't need people to love him. He needed them to anticipate the consequences of disobedience. And when those consequences were made brutally clear, obedience became reflex. In such a society, top-down orders could be executed with staggering speed and scale, regardless of how irrational or brutal they were. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had spent nearly 2 decades in a state of constant mobilization. Peace, if it existed, was just a pause between campaigns. Society was used to sacrificing the present for some vague future, used to enduring decisions they had no part in making. Meanwhile, the state had mastered the art of managing crisis, rationing scarcity, and maintaining order through coercion. But that very model carried within it seeds of danger. When all decisions were centralized, the system became rigid. When fear replaced feedback, errors went uncorrected. When loyalty was measured by silence, information was distorted before it ever reached the top. Stalin could control society, but at the cost of becoming increasingly isolated in a world of doctored reports and performative obedience. By 1941, the USSR possessed a vast apparatus capable of mobilizing millions of people and resources in a short time, but it was also fragile in another way. It relied heavily on top-down direction and lacked the ability to self-correct in moments of shock. Society was well trained to endure, but not to make autonomous decisions in chaos. So when war finally came, the traits forged in the Stalin era would become both the Soviet Union's greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. The capacity for limitless sacrifice, the familiarity with suffering, and the iron discipline would keep the USSR from collapsing outright. But the paralysis of independent thought, the fear of mistakes, and the inflexible command structure would make that first blow from the enemy more devastating than ever. And then, in the summer of 1941, when orders couldn't keep up with reality, when reports were fragmented by fear, when a system designed to manage crisis was suddenly confronted by a crisis far beyond its old models, the Soviet state would face the ultimate test of the very system Stalin had built. It was the moment when the machinery of governance by suffering began to shake violently under the blow named Barbarossa. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, when the first German artillery barrages tore through the skies above Western Soviet territory, the real shock wasn't the sheer power of the firepower, it was the silence that had preceded it. For weeks, even months, warning signs had been piling up. Reconnaissance reports noted unusual German troop concentrations, railroads across the border buzzed with constant activity, and cross-border incursions increased in frequency. But in a system built on fear and absolute obedience, information didn't flow naturally. It was filtered, distorted, sanitized, made safe before it ever reached the top. And at the top, Stalin chose not to believe. Stalin's skepticism wasn't entirely irrational. He believed Hitler wouldn't be foolish enough to open an Eastern Front while still facing Britain in the West. He believed that reports of an imminent attack could be Western provocations designed to drag the USSR into war. But in a system where suspicion had become the very instinct of governance, that suspicion didn't lead to vigilance. It led to paralysis. Border units were ordered not to provoke, not to respond forcefully, not to place the military on full combat alert. And when the war came, many units were still, on paper, in peacetime posture. The blow of Barbarossa didn't just strike the border. It struck at the very logic of the Soviet state. Communication lines were severed. Command lost contact with entire armies. Orders arrived late. conflicted, or not at all. In the first days, many units fought without knowing the broader situation, without knowing whether neighboring flanks had collapsed, without knowing whether to retreat or hold the line. Initiative, something that had been crushed for years, was now almost non-existent. The result was a collapse of unimaginable scale. Millions of soldiers were encircled in massive pockets. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel, artillery was destroyed because it couldn't be pulled back. Roads to the east were choked with desperate movement. Fleeing soldiers, civilians, local officials, vast swaths of territory fell so quickly that even those living through it could barely comprehend what was happening. A state once proud of its total control now witnessed total loss of control. Remarkably, this collapse didn't trigger rebellion or uprising against the central government. There was no new revolution erupting from the chaos, not because of deep-seated loyalty, but because society had grown too used to suffering without expecting change. In that moment, individual survival instinct outweighed political thought. Soldiers tried to escape encirclement. Civilians tried to flee the front. The state, for many in those early weeks, effectively vanished from daily life. In Moscow, the shock took another form, the silence of power. Stalin himself barely appeared in public in the early days. The leadership apparatus fell into hesitation, fear, and a wait-and-see paralysis, hoping for signals from the very top. When those signals didn't come, decisions were delayed, opportunities for counteraction were missed. A system built to function only on centralized orders discovered its fatal weakness. When the center froze, the entire body froze with it. The numbers from the summer and fall of 1941 were devastating, not just militarily, but psychologically. Millions of prisoners of war, tens of thousands of villages overrun, major cities falling to the enemy. For many, especially in the border regions, it seemed as though the Soviet state had completely failed in its basic function of protection. But unlike societies where state failure leads to the collapse of order, in the USSR, order had always rested on a different foundation. It wasn't built on trust in the state being right, but on the habit of the state simply being there, in whatever form. In this adversity, something critical happened. The fear once associated with the state began to give way to a more primal fear, the fear of raw survival. When death came from bombs and execution squads, the terror of secret police and labor camps receded. It didn't disappear, but it no longer felt like the most immediate threat. This psychological shift didn't follow a plan or a directive. It happened instinctively, and it created a vacuum where the old social reflexes no longer worked the way they once had. Stalin and the leadership eventually realized they were facing a war unlike any previous mobilization. This wasn't a crisis that could be managed with slogans or quotas. This was a war for survival, where the very existence of the state itself was directly threatened. And in that context, the old language of class struggle, of internal enemies, of purges, began to feel out of place in the brutal reality of the front lines. The opening weeks of Barbarossa exposed a bitter truth. The apparatus built to control society in peacetime was not automatically effective in modern warfare. It could mobilize, but not adapt. It could coerce, but not respond flexibly. And when struck unexpectedly, it reacted slowly and clumsily, like a massive machine trying to turn in a narrow space. Yet from that paralysis, the first signs of change began to stir. Not on paper, but in how the state spoke to its people, and how the people began to understand the war. When the initial failures were too big to hide, when the illusion of total control could no longer be maintained, the state was forced to find a new foundation on which to survive. Barbarossa didn't just shatter military lines, it shattered the old political language. And in that void, a slow but decisive shift began. From fighting for ideology to fighting for land, for family, for memory, and for the survival of a broader community. But in the psychology of an entire nation. The city wasn't defended like a traditional fortress. It was accepted as a place that would be destroyed, torn apart piece by piece. No one had illusions of preserving it intact. From the beginning, the logic of Stalingrad was different. If the enemy couldn't be defeated with overwhelming force, then they had to be pulled into the same depths of despair. The battle here wasn't about territory. It was about exhausting willpower. In the rubble of the city on the Volga, the concept of the front line disappeared. There was no front and rear. Every basement, every collapsed wall, every pile of bricks became a temporary front line. The German army, trained in mobile warfare, deep thrusts, and swift encirclements, was now forced into a grinding, slow-motion fight, where every meter of ground was paid for in blood. For the Soviet soldier, Stalingrad wasn't a place to survive long-term. It was a place to hold out just long enough. Many units were sent across the river with the unspoken understanding that survival was unlikely. But that despair didn't paralyze them. On the contrary, it created a cold logic. If there's no way back, then every hour the enemy is delayed carries strategic value. Individual sacrifice in this context was transformed into a resource. The Soviet state didn't hide the brutal nature of the task. There was no vague language. Orders were delivered with raw bluntness. Hold your position, do not retreat, no matter the cost. In a society already used to paying in lives, such commands didn't shock as they might elsewhere. They simply confirmed what everyone already knew. Stalingrad was a place where individual existence was subordinate to collective survival. In that tight, brutal space, time became the most important weapon. Each passing day drew the Germans deeper into a battle that neutralized their tactical and technical superiority. Each day stretched their supply lines further, exposing them to weakness. Meanwhile, the Soviets willingly traded bodies for time, the one resource they needed to regroup, stockpile, and prepare for the next move. What made Stalingrad a turning point wasn't any single battle, but the cold endurance of a strategy that bordered on inhuman. As the entire city became a battlefield, the line between soldier and civilian blurred. Loss became total, indiscriminate. But that totality shattered the illusion for the Germans that this was just another campaign in their long chain of victories. Throughout the months of combat, the Soviets didn't win in the conventional sense. They lost men, ground, entire neighborhoods. But they achieved something more important. They made it impossible for the enemy to withdraw without admitting defeat. By the time the Germans were in too deep, their symbols of victory were tied entirely to the name Stalingrad. Their strategic flexibility was trapped by their own ambition. The Soviet despair that defined the early stages of the war didn't disappear. It was redefined. From a desperate defensive posture, despair became a deliberate tool of strategy. There was no longer a goal of swift victory, only of ensuring the enemy couldn't escape easily. And when the time came, when reserves were ready, when flanking armies were in position, the counterattack didn't target the city. It struck the outer ring, where the enemy was thinnest. That moment marked a deep psychological shift. Not because the Germans had suddenly weakened, but because they realized, for the first time, that the Soviets were willing to endure any loss necessary to trap them. Stalingrad became a trap not through cunning tricks, but through endless patience and a willingness to sacrifice on a scale the enemy could not match, or refuse to. When the encirclement closed, the world began to view Stalingrad as a symbolic victory. But from inside, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like temporary relief. The kind felt by someone who had narrowly escaped death, knowing the cost had gone far beyond reason. Those who survived didn't emerge with illusions. They carried memories of a hell they had passed through, and the awareness that the road ahead was still long. Stalingrad proved that the Soviet Union could turn despair into strategy, but it also exposed the nature of that victory. It wasn't a triumph of finesse or humanity. It was a victory of numbers, of endurance, of the cold willingness to spend lives as part of a brutal equation. And in the moment now remembered as a turning point in history, a haunting question began to linger. If victory was won this way, what was its true cost? As the guns of Stalingrad fell silent, as the war map began to shift, the Soviet Union did not emerge from the battle as a redeemed society. It moved forward, carrying a harsh lesson carved in blood. Victory was possible, but it would never be free. And to understand how the USSR continued pushing westward despite its enormous losses, one must confront the coldest part of the story, the cost of victory, measured not just in land, but in lives. After Stalingrad, the world began to speak of the Soviet Union in a different tone, no longer as a regime on the brink of collapse, no longer as an easy target to swallow. On the map, red arrows slowly began to push back the black ones. But from the inside, victory did not wear the face of joy. It wore the face of exhaustion. A society long accustomed to suffering was now entering a phase where suffering was no longer just a means of survival, but the price to be paid simply to continue existing. The Soviet victory wasn't a sudden reversal of fate, but the accumulation of layered losses. Every step westward was bought with blood, not metaphorically, but in cold, statistical terms. Units were replenished not because they still had strength, but because they had been worn down so completely they needed full replacement. New soldiers often had no time to adapt to the battlefield. They were thrown into a war machine that ran on attrition, where individuals existed only long enough to fill the place of someone just fallen. Here, success wasn't measured by conserving forces, but by the ability to keep pushing forward despite the cost. That logic seeped into command decisions, into planning, into how success itself was defined. A battle wasn't considered lost if the strategic objective was achieved, even if the price paid would have been unacceptable by any other military standard. In this mindset, human beings weren't disrespected in a moral sense, they were simply treated as replaceable variables in a broader equation. What made that equation possible wasn't just population size, but a social psychology forged over decades. A society that had once endured famine, purges, and forced labor as normal life didn't collapse under the psychological weight of wartime loss. Pain no longer stunned, it was the baseline. In this context, the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands, even millions in a single campaign, didn't create a moral shock large enough to paralyze the system. But the cost of victory wasn't only in the death toll, it was in the distortion of the relationship between the individual and the state. As the war dragged on and survival was placed above all else, coldness became a valued trait. Too much compassion could be seen as weakness. Hesitation could be seen as betrayal. In that atmosphere, life or death decisions were made swiftly, not because the decision makers were heartless, but because they were used to suppressing emotion so that the machine could keep moving. Victory, in that sense, cast a long shadow. It reinforced the belief that this method worked, that a willingness to pay any price was the only path to survival in a hostile world. And once a method has proven effective in the most extreme conditions, it becomes incredibly hard to abandon. The Soviet state after Stalingrad didn't become more humane. On the contrary, it grew more confident in the righteousness of its cold logic. On the home front, that cost appeared in another form. Workers labored to the point of collapse. Women and children bore the burden of production under extreme shortages. Cities lived on minimal rations. Every military success meant a prolonged period of hardship behind the lines. There was no moment of release, only sustained pressure. Each advance created new demands to push faster, further, despite human resources wearing thin. In this logic, numbers became a strategic advantage. Not because they were cheap, but because they could be mobilized and remobilized. When one unit was wiped out, another was brought in. When one city was depleted, another took its place. War became a vast arithmetic problem. The goal was not to preserve each part, but to prevent the collapse of the whole. Yet even a system willing to sacrifice endlessly could not run on willpower alone. At a certain point, the number of available people wasn't enough to keep up with the pace of attrition. And it was here that another factor began to stand out more clearly in the story of Soviet victory: material. Steel, fuel, food, transport. Things that weren't symbolic, that didn't inspire, but ultimately determined the rhythm of war. After the devastating early years, the Soviet Union realized it couldn't continue to fight on sheer endurance alone. The cost of victory had reached a limit even this pain-hardened society could no longer sustain indefinitely. To move forward, it needed more than people willing to die. It needed people who were armed, fed, and moved. At that crossroads, the true nature of the war began to reveal itself. It was not only a battle of will, but a problem of industry and logistics. The sacrifices at Stalingrad and beyond had only created opportunity. To convert that opportunity into lasting advantage, the USSR had to rely on something just as cold, but less talked about: production capacity, supply lines, and the mathematics of material. And as the guns of the next great offensives roared to life, behind them stood not only soldiers ready to die, but trains, factories, and numbers on ledgers. It was at this point that the story of victory shifted to a new level, where blood and willpower still played a role, but were increasingly governed by industry, Lend-Lease, and the arithmetic of war. At some point after Stalingrad, the Soviet war effort ceased to be purely a story of endurance. It became a story of tempo, of output, of vast material flows operating behind the front lines. Blood was still shed, lives were still lost, but war decisions were now made less in the trenches and more in spreadsheets, production schedules, and along supply routes stretching thousands of kilometers. From the earliest months of invasion, the USSR launched one of the largest industrial relocations in history. Entire factories were dismantled, hauled across the Urals, and reassembled under conditions that bordered on the absurd. It wasn't a romantic act of heroism. It was a survival reflex from a state long used to crisis. Each factory saved wasn't a symbol of hope, but a guarantee that the war could go on for another month, another quarter, another year. In this process, people were treated as components of an expanding production system. Workers labored to the brink of collapse. Shifts ran night into day, and accidents became an accepted cost. In return, every tank, every artillery piece, every bullet was calculated with chilling precision. War was no longer a series of battles. It became a grand equation where the output of a factory could determine the launch of a campaign, where manufacturing time mattered as much as marching time. Here, the differences between the USSR and its enemy became clearer. Instead of chasing the most advanced weapons, the Soviets prioritized what could be made quickly, in large quantities, and easily repaired. Not because they didn't understand the value of high technology, but because they understood something more fundamental. Attritional war doesn't reward perfection. It rewards persistence. A good enough weapon, delivered on time and in overwhelming numbers, was more effective than a perfect weapon that rarely arrived. Alongside domestic industry ran another flow, quieter, but just as vital: foreign aid. Lend-Lease didn't deliver victory with a single knockout blow, but it filled gaps that no amount of human sacrifice could close. Trucks, locomotives, rail lines, fuel, food, things not tied to heroic myth, formed the foundation for every Soviet advance that followed. Crucially, this aid didn't replace Soviet endurance. It amplified it. Soldiers could be ready to die, but they had to be transported to the front. Artillery could fire non-stop, but only if shells arrived on time. Victory wasn't about winning a single engagement, but ensuring that there were still enough tools to fight tomorrow. Lend-Lease, therefore, wasn't a symbol of dependence. It was an extension of the logistical equation the USSR had committed to solving. Seen from this perspective, the cold logic becomes more understandable. The decision to launch a campaign was no longer rooted in spirit or symbolism alone, but in production and attrition ratios. How many tanks are lost each month? How many can be replaced? How many troops can be trained and moved? How much food is needed to sustain both army and home front? These were the questions that decided the fate of millions, answered not in speeches, but in numbers. In that equation, the USSR gradually gained the upper hand, not because it suffered less, but because it could recover faster. When losses became inevitable, the only strategy left was to ensure the enemy ran out first. War became a race of industrial stamina and logistics, and victory would go to the side that could maintain its pace longer, not just to the side that won more battles. This shift also reshaped the perception of victory. Gone were singular, defining moments. What remained was accumulation. Every train that arrived on time, every factory that increased output, every supply line held, these were victories, small and unsung, but together they created an unshakable advantage. By war's end, when the Red Army marched into Central Europe, the visible image was one of overwhelming force. But behind that image was a system that had learned to turn suffering into data, sacrifice into planning, and war into a calculation. It was not a beautiful victory. It did not bring spiritual renewal to society, but it was effective. And that effectiveness is what explains why the Soviet Union didn't collapse in 1941. Not just because it could endure more or sacrifice more, but because it transformed into a process that could be managed, a process in which emotion was subordinated to industry, logistics, and cold arithmetic. In that world, survival wasn't a miracle. It was the solution to a brutal equation, one that the USSR, with all its loss and pain, solved to the very end. When the last guns fell silent and the red flag flew above the ruins of Berlin, the world looked at the Soviet Union as a victor. On the map, it was the largest continental power in Europe. At the negotiating tables, it sat as one of the forces shaping the New World Order. But if you listened more closely, behind the silence of war was not the sound of rebirth. It was the heavy breathing of a society drained to its core. The Soviet Union survived. That much is undeniable. But survival did not mean recovery. It was like a body that had just emerged from massive hemorrhage, still standing, still moving, but never again whole. The wounds weren't just etched into the physical landscape of the country, but deeply inscribed in its collective psyche, in how people saw the world, the state, and themselves. The war reinforced a dangerous yet persistent belief that limitless sacrifice was the price of existence, that human lives could be spent like a resource as long as the final objective was achieved. That coldness in decision-making wasn't a moral failure, it was a necessary virtue of power. These lessons didn't disappear with peace. They became the foundation of how the Soviet Union operated for decades to come. Materially, the price of victory was a nation devastated on an unimaginable scale. Cities reduced to rubble, villages emptied, an entire generation of men either gone or permanently broken. But spiritually, the cost was even greater. A society accustomed to constant mobilization no longer knew how to live in a normal state. Peace didn't bring a sense of safety. It brought a vague anxiety that the next crisis was only a matter of time. The Soviet state emerged from the war with immense prestige, but also with a deep paradox. The very model that had ensured survival now made recovery nearly impossible. When power is built on the capacity to endure suffering and sacrifice lives, loosening control begins to look like a threat. When victory proves that ruthlessness works, there is little internal incentive to change the method. The Soviet Union didn't collapse in 1941 because it had long ago learned how to survive in hell. But precisely because it was so used to hell, it never truly stepped out of it. The war didn't create this distortion. It legitimized and deepened what was already there. A society can endure the unimaginable, but the cost is losing the ability to imagine anything else. Looking back, the real question is not how the Soviet Union won, but what it became after winning. Victory brought power, territory, and global stature, but it did not bring healing. It left behind a legacy where people were used to being sacrificed, used to staying silent, used to placing the survival of the state above all other standards. A society like that may be hard to defeat from the outside, but over time, it's vulnerable to erosion from within. That's why the story of 1941 is not just about a failed invasion or a heroic victory. It's a story about the limits of human endurance, about how a nation can survive even when crushed, but how that survival doesn't always mean wholeness. The Soviet Union proved that people can live through the harshest conditions imaginable, but it also, unintentionally, proved that survival is not always a complete victory. This is the coldest legacy of the Great Patriotic War, a nation that stood tall but carried fractures that would never fully heal. And perhaps it's within those cracks that we begin to understand why the USSR could go so far in war, but struggled to build a future that wasn't rooted in endless mobilization and sacrifice. If you have your own thoughts on this story, on the true cost of victory, and what it really means not to collapse, leave a comment below. Different perspectives are how history continues to have a voice. And if you want to explore deeper analysis of war, power, and the fate of nations, don't forget to subscribe to History War so you never miss a video.